If you have your Bibles this morning with you, turn to Ephesians chapter 5. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral person, impure or greedy person, such a man as an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of God. Let me continue with 6 and 7. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. Man, what a paragraph. There's so much in here. I wanted to see if we can dive into this and talk about what it means to live the kind of life that he says, live a life of love. Now, later on, we're going to see a section where he's describing people. It is obvious they're not living a life of love. If you could sort of categorize it, it would be a life of love centered on love of self. But there's two kinds of life. Are we going to live a life of love that reflects God? Or are we going to live a life of love that reflects self? And he starts off with something Paul does that's a little bit different than he normally talks about, because I know when he writes to Timothy and Titus and others, Paul will say, be imitators of me as I also am of Christ. Well, that's not how he starts this off. He starts off, be imitators of God. Oh, how do I imitate God? Now, that's a tall order, isn't it? Now, I think what he's going to do is to help us understand that when I am living a life of love, I'm seeking to imitate God because God is love. Okay? But what does that look like? And how do I know if my life is actually being lived out that way? How do I imitate God? I would say that the first simple answer is to look at Jesus. If you have your Bibles, turn over to Philippians. And I want to read Philippians 2. Let's begin with chapter 2, verse 1. This is one of my favorite chapters in all of Paul's writings, Philippians 2. And he's going to start off with a little paragraph here talking about how they need to relate to each other. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. And Paul is saying, if you've experienced this in your Christian life, pass it on. Make sure that if you've experienced this, you share it with someone else. That's the mindset of Christ. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Woo, that's hard, isn't it? How do you consider others better than yourself? I'm not quite sure I'm there yet, are you? That's a difficult order, because it's a lifestyle where that in humility you consider others better than yourself. Each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interests of others. Some have said that this is probably one of the best short definitions of servanthood that you'll find in all the New Testament. that you're looking not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. And I believe that the short time that Nancy and I have been here with this congregation, we have seen that in you, that many of you exhibit for us. I'm encouraged by it. Constantly, you're concerned about the interest of others. And that's how you show your life of love. Now, Paul's going to then say all of this is possible. It's possible because, or only if, your attitude is the same of Jesus Christ. Now, that's interesting. So if I'm going to walk a life of love, and simply it's trying to be like Jesus, and that's how I imitate God. So tell me about Jesus. What is his attitude like? Paul's going to give a definition or extension of an idea of what that means. Here's Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. In this paragraph, here's what Paul's doing. He said, I'm going to talk to you about the attitude of Jesus. He made himself nothing. He emptied himself of his own self-interest, self-centeredness, anything just about him. He was seated at the right hand of God. He came to this earth, came in this form of a servant, became obedient to death, buried, God raised him from the dead. He ascended back into heaven, and he's at the right hand of God. And Paul is saying, if you want to have the attitude of Jesus, I want you to look at his life. Look at what he did. Look at what he gave up. It's fascinating to me that as it starts off, he says, he, the very nature of God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped or to hung on to. See, can you imagine? Jesus would have said to God, now God, I know you want me to go to earth and accomplish your will, but I kind of like it here being on the right hand of the throne. I'm going to hold on to this spot. Send somebody else. No, he gave us everything related to being at the right hand of the Father. He considered it not something to be held on to for selfish reasons and gave that up for the good of humanity. What a beautiful passage this is. As Paul is writing in Ephesians 5, back at our text for this morning, he says, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. Do you realize that walking in love, we can do that only if we understand that we truly are beloved. It's hard to walk in love if you don't understand how much you're loved. I think of our granddaughter Isla all the time. She knows how much she's loved. And it's interesting to watch her little life sort of unfold. And I know you've seen this in your children and grandchildren. To see how they act, what they say, what they do, because in their little hearts, they know they're loved. It's an amazing thing. I was just reading recently, and I heard someone talk about this. How many children in our country are growing up not knowing that they're wanted, not knowing that they're loved? Can you imagine what it's going to do to them as they grow up into a young adult? Not knowing that you belong anywhere, not knowing that you're loved, and that you're accepted, and that you're part of a family? Yeah, I just can't imagine what that would be like. Paul says, then as beloved children, live a life of love. And it's interesting because the word live here literally is a word, something like walk around. It means your lifestyle, as you go around, you walk around in love. And Paul gives us two broad guidelines. So we say, okay, Paul, how can we do that? How can we live a life of love? Two things. It's as Christ loved us and he gave himself up for us. So at the very core of this is self-sacrificial love. It's the kind of love that's willing to give up self, And Paul says it's an offering and sacrifice to God that is an aroma of sweet smell. Let me explain it this way. That kind of goes over our heads when we read that. But it's Old Testament sacrificial language. Let me give you a great example. But it says the sweet smell and aroma of the offering. Last night, as it got dark, I went to put some cardboard boxes and stuff in a recycling bin. And I stopped and went, man, what is that? Our neighbors are grilling steak. Wonder how come they didn't invite me? Man, you know that smell, don't you? The neighbors are grilling steak. Well, that's what Paul's talking about here, that sweet aroma and smell that would come from a sacrifice. We know that smell. It smells really good. Paul is saying there's nothing sweeter, nothing better than to think about what Christ has done for each one of us. And when you think about that, that defines how God wants to see us loving others and living that life of love. So, in other words, does our life smell as sweet to others as grilled steak on the grill does to me? Do I smell that way to others? Okay. What a great example that is. And then Paul is going to talk about, and he makes a shift here, and I'm going to assume something, because I've often said that Paul's letters are kind of like listening on one end of the conversation of a telephone conversation. Have you ever been shopping and you're going down the aisle? People talk on their phones like they don't know they're in a public place. And you're like, whoa, you can almost guess what the other person's saying on the other end, all because of what they're saying. Well, Paul's letters are kind of like that. We don't get the discussion on the other side, but we get Paul writing to the situation. I'm assuming that there were Christians in the church at Ephesus that had a really hard time leaving their old life of sin. And not only that there were some Christians, though they had left that old life of sin, they were still being tempted to be drawn away by people that they knew. I remember a few years ago, a young man that I baptized into Christ, he left the area. I was like, why are you leaving? He says, I cannot live the Christian life without leaving. There's too many people that I know that are going to try to drag me back into the life I used to know. I said, I've got to get out of here. That young man was sharp enough to know what his limits were. Now, I get the impression that some of this is going on in the church at Ephesus. He said, but among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality. No fornication is the word here, no sexual perversion, nothing outside of the sexual relationship in marriage, or of any kind of impurity. That means impure motives, impure thoughts, things that you shouldn't be thinking and doing. And it's interesting because as you grow to be more like Christ, living out the life of love, it is going to be fascinating. The more spiritually mature you become, the more aware you are of how impure things are and how impure activities people are involved in, things that don't represent the heart and mind of Christ. Okay? And so Paul is saying, I want you to be aware of that. No covetousness. I'm like, Okay. No inordinate desire after things, wanting things, possessing things, and especially to the extent that you're willing to let it. It's someone's described covetousness like this. Instead of possessing material things, the material things possess you. Okay. I heard one person say one time, the problem with getting more tools to put in your garage and to use in your yard, the more maintenance they need. So that every time you buy something, you got to spend a lot of time maintaining it. That's true. Think about material things. the more you get, the more they possess your own soul and your own heart. No filthiness. The NIV says, no kind of impurity or greed, because I'm going to talk a moment about what he says fitting and proper, but he says there shouldn't be any obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse jesting. Really? No, there shouldn't be. That challenges us. I remember in one church that there was a gentleman who came to Christ, and it was amazing to see how on fire he was. He wanted to grow spiritually. He was just excited about learning about Jesus and learning how to live the Christian life. And one Sunday morning, he came into the vestibule back there, and he said, man, he said, I'm amazed at the leaders of our church. And here was his expression. He said, they are doing one hell of a job in this church. And he caught himself. And I think his name was Dan. I said, Dan, I understand. I said, we know that you're trying to change a lifestyle that is very filthy. You told a lot of dirty jokes all the time. You told us that. But he recognized it wasn't an easy thing. It's not, and I think this is something we need to learn. When men and women come to faith, that conversion has, it's interesting. It has an initial impact, but it's also ongoing. There's not a one of us that became perfect when we came to Christ. No. We come to Christ so that we can be perfected through his work in our heart. And that's a process. And for some of us, we have more to overcome than others, don't we? So here he is talking to individuals who, as we would say, they need to clean up their act. No silly talking or the talk of fools. And then he says, all of these are not fitting. And he then says, they're out of place. They're improper. So do you realize that the way we live, there is a proper, appropriate way to speak, to act, to relate to other people, because we're living a life of love. And he says that those who live this way, he's going to sort of go back and encapsulate this in a big picture. For of this you can be sure, no sexually immoral person, impure or greedy person, such a man is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. For Paul, Christians being aware of the inheritance was very, very important. He always wanted them to know, you have an inheritance. You're living toward that inheritance. The Spirit of God, remember back in chapter 1 of Ephesians, the Spirit of God is imprinted in you. And not only that, but it is the seal and the guarantee of your inheritance. So he's already talked about that. He does not want them to forget. I want to give you a good illustration about this. This happened just this last week. And I told Nancy, and I'm going to tell on her, because when I told her the story, she got choked up. One of my students that I work with lives near a large town in Oklahoma. And right now, as you know, our school, like businesses, comes toward the end of the year, you have to put out an annual report. Have you ever worked for a company that, got to put out an annual report at the end of the year? Well, the president called me, and I'm kind of in charge of getting people's pictures, getting something of their story to go along with it. So whenever the alumni of the school and the board looks at that annual report, they can see people's pictures, and they can see what the people are very much involved in. But this one student says, I do have a ministry I'm involved in, but I don't tell anybody at my church, and I certainly don't want you to put it in the annual report. This blew my mind. I think that this student is in her late 50s. She may be 60. She has a unique ministry where she goes downtown, sits down at the corner of one of the street corners, and she talks to the prostitutes in that city. And she says, I massage their feet, because I think she retired as a massage therapist. She said, but I've got a captive audience, and I tell them about Jesus. She says, 2 women have come to Christ because of her doing that. And here was the sad part, though. She told me on the phone it took her a long time to find a church in the city where she lives that would accept women who've come to Christ because they were a prostitute. I said, really? Really? When you come to Christ, I don't care where you come from. The power of the cross deals with that. Now, I'll guarantee you that those 2 women coming to Christ, my student's going to have a lot to help them work through. I'll guarantee you. But the power of the gospel. This lady, the student, you talk about walking in love. Now, here's the other thing I want to add to that. It's been amazing to me through the years to listen to people's stories of how in quiet ways, it's not on the front page of the paper, they don't announce it in church, but the quiet ways that so many Christians go about extending the kingdom, serving others, walking in love. I got to tell myself on this one, because you know how the Lord teaches you a lesson that stays with you the rest of your life? This was one of those. At the second church where we were working at years ago, on the second row of the auditorium or the sanctuary, sitting on the second row over here that I could see as I was preaching, there was a gentleman who owned a dairy farm. And he would come in and he would sit down every Sunday morning. And I mean, he hadn't been set down for 10 seconds and he was sound asleep. So I remember one day, as we were going home, his name was Marvin. We were going home and I'm driving. And so I just finally left. I said, Nancy, Marvin never pays attention to anything, so I just wish he would never come. And of course, Nancy, what? So that next week, you know how the Lord teaches you lessons? That next week, Marvin called me and he said, would you mind, and we lived in West Tennessee, would you mind driving me to Memphis? I said, what do you need to go to Memphis for? He said, well, my doctors have discovered that I have the worst case of sleep apnea they've ever seen on record. And so what they want to do is take me for it's connected to the University of Memphis, but it was the medical hospital. They want to use my case to train doctors. So as we're driving along, I'm driving to Memphis. Well, he drove there. I drove his car back, but he drove. He said, reach in the glove compartment there. So I reached in the glove compartment. He said, now, that's my will. And if something happens to me, it's got a letter in there that I want you to give my wife. I said, really? So I said, okay. And he said, now, I know, and he said something like, I know that I sleep at church on Sunday, but he said, I know you're the kind of person that wouldn't hold it against anybody. Oh, so, but that whole scenario, it just made me realize, and I realized this through the years, you don't know what a person's dealing with, and you don't know what they're doing for the kingdom in quiet ways. That's going to make a big difference in the world around. God knows. That's why this thing about walking in love is not about making a big splash on the front of the newspaper or in the evening news or whatever. God has each one of us living where we're at to do the little things that make a big difference. My goodness. And we need to take that seriously. Okay? Then he says, there's a worship of selfish desires, and we talked about adultery and idolatry that seeks to gain what is rightfully others because you're only thinking about yourself. And even though when you read through this passage, it sounds like it can be pretty negative. He said, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Men and women of faith who are walking in love intentionally want their hearts, and think about this, intentionally want their hearts to be obedient. And I just wonder if part of our prayer every morning ought to be something like, or include something like, Lord, you know how frail I am, okay? But my desire is I want to obey, I want to be obedient today. I want to fulfill your desires for my life. I know I'm weak. I know I make mistakes. I know I'm human. Got flaws all over the place. But I still want to obey you. I want to be obedient. Here's what's amazing about this passage, though. Walking in love, I found at least 6 things in this paragraph that I want to mention quickly that define walking in love. And he's mentioned all these kind of lifestyles, all these ways that people live, the way you used to live. He said, no, that's not it. That's not proper. It's not the place for the Christian. But if you want to walk in love, you have the positive command of following or being an imitator of God. You are one of his beloved children. It's based on the beautiful sacrifice of Christ. And you're aware of what's fitting and proper. You're constantly thinking about that. Paul said, let there be thanksgiving. Did you realize in the middle of all this? He said very clearly, rather give thanksgiving. Wow. And we have an inheritance in the kingdom. That's what it means to walk in love. And the rest of this paragraph describes the kind of life that is the opposite of walking in love. They're not imitating God. They're not beloved children. They have no inheritance in the kingdom. And for some reason, Paul says, let no one deceive you with empty words. I am afraid that in the Ephesian church, there are some people trying to deceive others with empty words. We don't know what those empty words were, but it had to do something with perhaps drawing them, enticing them back into the way of life they used to live. Paul said, don't listen to them. Don't be partners with them. You see, there are some things in the Christian life we just cannot be partners with. And I think we know that. As time goes on and we live in the Christian life, you just cannot join people in some things that they do. They're not fitting, they're not proper, as Paul would say. What a beautiful passage this is. Because it helps us understand that our Christian life is meant to imitate God, imitate Christ, and to do it in such a way that people can see we have changed. And that for some people that change is difficult. And they can be enticed to go back, and people can flatter with empty words and try to get them to come back and go a direction that's against that initial commitment to Christ and conversion. But I love this passage because it helps us understand what it means to let Christ be the one that you're imitating, and that your life, like Christ, becomes a sweet aroma, a sweet smell to those all around you. It's kind of funny. I have a particular fragrance or aftershave lotion I like to put on in the morning. I'm almost out of it. I like the way it smells. I said, Nancy, does that smell good? Yeah, it smells good. Well, it's like, as Christians every morning, we put on the fragrance of Christ because we want people to see us and to smell us like we ought to. If you need to become a Christian, or you need to come to the cross to imitate God in Jesus Christ for what he's done, let's stand together and sing number 715 as we offer the invitation.